Hello, freedom loving people, and welcome to the Restricted Handling Podcast. Today, we're talking about one of our favorite topics, anything that makes life harder, potentially for Putin or China. This time, we're digging into the upcoming C5+1 talks that are taking place in DC in the coming hours. Central Asian government heads of state meeting with Trump and other parts of the US government. This has real implications for Russia, its ability to fight in Ukraine, China, and US relations. As always, you've got myself, Ryan Fugit, former Army Aviator, former CIA officer. I'm joined by our illustrious co-host, Glenn Corrin, who spent over 30 years in the US government, most of that at the CIA as a senior intelligence service officer, multi-time chief of station, covering a host of areas, including Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. Glenn is now an advisor at Great South Bay, providing strategy on real-world insights for businesses, military, and governments. And we are joined, embarrassment of riches today, by Paul Farley. Paul is also a former senior officer at the CIA, spent more than 3 decades doing high-stakes intel operations across LATAM, the Middle East, but more importantly today, as the head of the CIA South and Central Asia Mission Center, known internally as SCAMC, from 2018 to 2022. Paul is now a senior advisor at West Exec Advisors, where his intel community experience helps bridge government and industry in security solutions. Paul, we're so lucky to have you. Thank you very much. And just want to ask before we kick off, how do you and Glenn know each other?
Thanks for the introduction. Very kind. How do I know Glenn? So one of my tours decades ago in South Asia, and I didn't know Glenn, but he was stationed in an adjoining country. And so I got to sort of indirectly know him. And I gotta tell you, and I think I told this to Glenn when we finally did meet in person. The first several times I was like, who in the hell is this guy? Who is this guy? Where does he think he's coming from? But the things that were the things that were being written coming our way. But I could tell the guy was high energy. And so it was and it was nothing bad, but it was like, wow, this guy's high speed. And so I think it was I don't know, maybe like 15 years later, we were in Washington, I believe, or it might have been overseas. And we were in a course probably or in a meeting, and I finally met him in person though. So, and then from that point on, realized what all the hoopla was about and heard plenty about him. And I think we sort of crossed paths while he was overseas, and I might have been in Washington or vice versa. So, and we've known each other ever since for probably at least probably 20 years or so.
Glenn, is that how you remember it?
Well, what Paul leaves out is when we actually did meet in person, he did punch me. It was a good shot, right? And he hit in the shoulder. Now that, as I recall, we were in 2 adjoining countries, very intense time. And Paul's kind of a legend. I mean, I let him tell his story, but he did a lot for the country and in a very hard places. And then the last time we got to interact, I was overseas. He was running SCAMC, and we got to spend some time together when he came out with a visit, which was a lot of fun.
As we kick off here, Paul, I think most people, myself included, don't know a ton about Central Asia, the C5+1. Can you just ground us in what is this meeting? I mean, it's high enough up that Trump's going to partake in it with these heads of state. What's the context for this?
No, this is a big deal, and I think obviously the timing is important. So C5, the 5 Central Asia countries plus 1, the U.S. obviously started about 15 years ago. I think it was Secretary of State John Kerry, and basically as a way to kind of group the 5 regional countries together as a block to engage with the United States. I think for those initial years, it got a little bit of traction and it sort of fell off due to other higher pressing issues out there. And it's always sort of been in the background and in the shadows of other foreign policy directions of the US. And I think the 5 countries, for those Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyz Republic or Kyrgyzstan. And the 2 big dogs of those of that region is Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan from a development standpoint, but the others are something in their own right. So this is a chance really to sort of, I think, jumpstart. They've been meeting ever since they formed this organization or this group of meetings. And other countries in the world have their own, EU plus C5, basically their version of what we're doing. Korea's got their version with the 5 countries as well. But I think it's really, and with President Trump in the driver's seat back here. And as you mentioned, the neighborhood that these 5 countries are in, they touch Iran, they border Iran, Russia, China, Afghanistan. So it's a pretty funky neighborhood. And I would say even before, it's been interesting, even before Russia invaded Ukraine, these countries were looking to diversify and to sort of spread their wings a bit and come out from under the shadow of, or the thumb, I should say, in some cases, of Russia. And, China, as usual, sort of jumped in and was filling the need and doing development projects. But there was something still missing. And I noticed it, when I was working it and going out to those countries from 2018 through 2022, just the difference, and especially after 2020 invasion. And they really wanted to engage a lot more vigorously with the United States. They're like, hey, listen, we've got something to offer. And then you jump, fast forward to today where it's, rare earth minerals and China extorting us and other countries doing things. So it's a fantastic opportunity. I've been one since I got out and talking to, business leaders, talking to companies. It's great to have government to government type of engagement. But I've been a big advocate for the private sector, the U.S. private sector needs to get in there much more vigorously. There are opportunities galore, development, extractables, water management, fill in the blank, their infrastructure. So I think these meetings that started today and tomorrow at the White House with the president, the timing is great. It's 10-year anniversary, and people talk about the transactional nature of President Trump and this administration. But there is a lot to offer, and I think this is a great chance to shine a light on the region, which I think for a lot of people is very esoteric. It's very far. Probably most Americans can't find it on the map, but it's worth discovering. It's worth the effort to get there. They want us there. It's a little cliche-ish. The U.S. can be the partner of choice, and I think in some sense, they mean that. And we need to show up, which is 90% of the battle. So, anyway, it's fun to watch, and there's a lot of opportunity to be had there.
Glenn, anything before I keep going here?
I agree with everything Paul said. I think it's great that the president of the United States is giving the leaders of those countries this level of attention, hosting them in Washington. We've seen him do that with the Turkish president, the Azeri president, the Armenian prime minister, countries that don't traditionally get a lot of spotlight from Washington to the White House. That's great. I would just say that, for many of us, we will remember even before 9/11, some of the countries in that region were very good partners for us on the counterterrorism front. They were face to face with the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And without going into great detail, I would just say that I have very fond memories of our partners in that region who were very good at what they did on the security side and very dedicated. And they were a lot of fun to work with. So, dostlarımızga salam. New York'tan.
And I would add, if you don't mind me jumping back in here, I think for a long time, especially during the Afghan war, and even since just before 2021, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a lot of our engagement with Central Asia was, as Glenn noted, through the lens of counterterrorism. Foreign military sales, CT cooperation, let us help you build capacity because Afghanistan, whatever it's going to, they don't want it flowing north. So that was an opening. That was a way to get in there. But I think, this is a great chance to move beyond that. I mean, I think U.S. foreign policy based on CT, based on foreign military sales, that's all good. But there's so much more economically, industrially, manufacturing wise, which is a win-win for everybody. So I think that's and I made some comments to some folks here. There ought to be a trade delegation going out there, almost like the president's trip to the Middle East, where he brings business leaders out there to see for themselves the opportunities and to talk to senior leaders. So hopefully this is a start to that. And I know there are a lot of business engagements there going on.
How about just as we talk about the region and how difficult the neighborhood is? I mean, you were in that role, Paul, when Russia invaded. Do you remember that day? Like, what are the days afterwards? As much as you can talk about just like the outreach that you mentioned and the change from CT.
Yeah, I mean, things it was interesting because from 2018, and I started making trips out there, and I would hit all the countries, and there were some that I went back to more than others, with an eye towards our withdrawal from Afghanistan. So you can imagine some of the countries that border Afghanistan, and they were nervous, right? And they want to contain, but also Russia was nervous, and Russia is looking down at Central Asia as sort of the buffer. And so these countries, and Glenn can speak to it more than I can, but I mean, the history, former Soviet republics and ethnic Russian, northern Kazakhstan is very heavily ethnic Russian. And Russia supplies gas. There's the migrant workers. So Russia's got a lot of leverage on some of these countries. So you had the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which sort of goosed the relationship a bit. They wanted to talk to us a lot more because of the nervousness of what may transpire and flow northward. And then, and it was interesting, and I really, and there's certain countries where I'd go out there, had good engagement with senior leaders, and and I always felt pretty good about it, and you sort of, you take everything with the right amount of skepticism, but some really good discussions. And I remember distinctly going out to a certain country after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it was the discussion had gone on steroids to the point where, what can you give us? What more can we do with you? What can you sell us? Now, they were talking about weapon systems, things that went well beyond us, but very interested in saying, wait a minute, we've got some of the same demographic in our country. We've got some vulnerabilities here. So and I noticed that traveling around to several countries, though, where they were concerned. And so, nothing like, trouble in the neighborhood and some adversaries literally on their doorstep to draw them closer to us. And so I think, to your question, the relationships and the engagement, which were already good, got even better.
Why is this meeting happening now in DC? Was it always on the books? Glenn has been calling for us to go and really examine this for some time, but is it time with the China dialogue that we just had or saw, or some of the negotiations with Russia?
I can't speak to the scheduling part of it other than it being, 10 years. And so it's time, and it was time to bring them to Washington. And I do think, and I've talked to folks who have who put bugs in their ears, and I and others have made a case. And I think with the minerals issue and really Central Asia, and you look at what they provide, and the largest source of uranium out of Kazakhstan. I mean, you've got minerals, tungsten, chromium, rare earths, a lot of very critical minerals that are there. So just like the Russia issue, and with transportation and logistics, which is a whole other part of the discussion, what it's opening up. But China, sort of putting the squeeze on countries who are now eager to look for alternate supplies. And so I think it's just a confluence of events, and then a change in the administration that is looking again, where's the business to be made, and how can we both benefit here? So I think it's a natural progression, and I think he did the president went to the Middle East, he's done that, and you've got Asia covered, Central Asia. They're all clamoring, they're all hoping, and I'm sure they're all going to extend an invitation to the president to go visit Central Asia, and I think that would be phenomenal. And knowing him, it could happen, but that would be, just another layer of icing on the cakes.
In the cultures of Central Asia, it is so important to have this level of respect shown to you, to be hosted at the White House, to be hosted in Washington by the President of the United States. To Paul's point, if the president were to go to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, it would send such a strong message. The challenge is can you go to all the countries? And if you only go to one, as Paul knows, it creates angst in other countries. But, I agree with Paul 1,000%. We had a great relationship based on counterterrorism because those countries in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s were worried about the Taliban and what was happening in Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda. In my opinion, we failed to transition when we had the opportunity to a better, let's say, economic, commercial relationships. American companies were slow to get in. There are reasons for that. I mean, it's not all the fault of American companies. There are challenges in the region for sure. And of course, the Russians were working behind the scenes to undermine the U.S. everywhere they could. They were so worried that we were going to, they view Central Asia as their sphere of influence. And what you have now, too, is a very interesting situation where Russia can't project its power like it was. The Chinese are projecting power, which makes Russia uncomfortable. And as Paul said, a lot of these countries are looking for some balance, and they want the U.S. to be players. And this administration has made it very clear. I think I told you, Ryan, I was at a meeting where someone senior in the administration said Central Asia and the Western Hemisphere are going to get a lot more attention than they were getting. They've been ignored for too long. That's one. And then two, commercial diplomacy. Like U.S. businesses need to be a part of our effort to project influence, what we would say is positive influence, into the region. And there are great opportunities. It's going to be tough and challenging because it's a very complex region, but I think there's definitely great opportunities. And Americans are supposed to be risk takers, pioneers. So all
And you
you
had,
business people out there, let's do it.
and then just to follow up a little bit here, the why now, and during UNGA. Okay, so we just had UNGA here last month or whatever, back in September. You had Kazakhstan that ordered, $4 billion worth of locomotives from a U.S. company. Uzbekistan, huge order, billions of dollars with Boeing. So here you go. They're coming in, and these guys, these heads of state, very wise. They're very well traveled, and they're on to what makes this administration tick. But they're also very much in need. So they're coming here to buy. They're amping up their AI capability, the cyber, the whole fintech area. So they're tuned into Silicon Valley. They've got folks here studying. So they really want to, it's not all about the U.S. going there and extracting, minerals and resources and things. But it's these countries as well that are looking for, Silicon Valley, looking for the Elon Musks and others to set up shop there. They've got a young population. They've got a lot to offer. They're educated. They're all learning English. They're basically banning the learning of Russian language in schools there. And it's, you're learning Uzbek if you're in English, if you're living in German, probably if you're in Uzbekistan. So a really fascinating time here. But these are countries that are doing business and buying stuff and wanting trade and technology and education from the U.S. So it's another win-win proposition here. But I think the UNGA thing and some of those deals that were made probably has a role in the timing here.
This is a great segue because you mentioned the leverage that Russia might have, just given how close these countries are. And we'll put a map up so people can see. But truly, I mean, they border Russia and China. They're right in the middle of this area. But just by the numbers, Kazakhstan does roughly $44 billion in trade with China, $28 billion annually with Russia. Uzbekistan is somewhere around $17 billion in each direction. Even Tajikistan's trade tops $1 billion in both directions. You have energy dependence with Russian gas flowing into Uzbekistan. Turkmenistan sends most of its gas to China through the Central Asia-China pipeline. You still got Kazakhstan relying on Russian export routes. I mean, it's a very complicated web of energy and economics. And I would imagine, like with sanctions that have been levied on Russia and China, these heads of state have to walk a very delicate line to not piss off the wrong person.
It's true. And some of the spike you see in trade with Russia is actually kind of like sanctions busting stuff. So yeah, the countries, so the dirty little secret there is, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan increasing trade, but it's also, it's sanction stuff. So that's not all of it, but that's a part of it. The leverage, countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyz Republic, where you've got upwards of half of their GDP is from remittances from migrant workers. So that's leverage galore. The gas, the pipelines, and Russian gas, to Europe, that has really put in overdrive the development, the discussion on the middle corridor. So trying to bypass Russia, going through, Kazakhstan, over the Caspian into Azerbaijan. So there's this whole network that's setting up though. And you got countries like, especially like Azerbaijan, Turkey, Georgia, that are basically creating the route, talking about a pipeline under the Caspian to go from the shore of Kazakhstan across to Azerbaijan, upwards into Europe, though, bypassing Russia. So it's really prompted a look at alternative methods here. You've got rail, whether it's rail, whether it's pipeline or ports. There's a whole bunch of work going on here. China's trying to get its goods to Europe. So they're looking at, rail across, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, over westward to get into Europe, though. So, but there's no denying that Russia's got leverage, but it's also, Kazakhstan has also done a really good job. And as the other countries have done a good job of really developing with the EU, with European partners, with the Japanese. I mean, it's amazing looking at the heads of state. The president of Finland was just out there going around these countries. I mean, they're doing renewable, green energy, renewables, water management, just a bunch of things they need, a lot of basic infrastructure things they need, but also logistics and getting energy, east, west, and north, south. So it's a fascinating time. And with all of that, they're looking for U.S. assistance. One of the things these countries pride themselves on, it's this multi-vector foreign policy. So with all of their neighbors and the neighborhood they live in, and with the different kinds of leverage that Russia, for one, has on some of these countries, and even China, just by development and investment, these countries, as you mentioned, Ryan, they're sort of trying to straddle this fence of not pissing any of them off, but also not having exclusive rights though. So they're being pretty bold, and they're unapologetically working with U.S., engaging us, but also not stopping working with Russia, China, and others. So it's fascinating. Turkmenistan with its positive neutrality. That's their sort of benchmark foreign policy. We'll deal with everybody unless they're hostile towards us. They're sort of watching the world and taking the best practices and applying them. And so far, it's working. Nothing's going to be easy. The U.S. has a lot of catching up to do because we're somewhat late to the game here. And again, I would argue it's the private sector of the U.S. that is really missing the opportunities. It's being discovered more. I mean, Chevron's been, they've been in Kazakhstan for years, developing gas and stuff. So it's not unknown to the U.S., but it's got to become a lot more familiar.
Glenn, if I can come to you, just, nobody that I know knows Russia, Turkey, those players the way you do. How is Putin probably viewing this C5+1 at this time? This is his backyard. Also, Turkey, I would imagine it feels like it's always a significant player in this part of the world. How are you looking at those two?
In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Turkey kind of tried to take the leading role in representing, let's say, the West, NATO, the U.S. in Central Asia. They promoted the idea that they are Turkic peoples primarily, with the exception of Tajikistan. Common language, obviously, common religion. They tried very hard in the 90s to promote like Turkey as the alternative to Russia. It didn't work out well, and the Turks have since, they lost a lot of leverage, I'd say in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, but they've been trying again to create this Turkic world concept, play a role. They're obviously very big in Azerbaijan, very big partners for the Azeris. They helped the Azeris in the war in Nagorno-Karabakh incredibly. And I think they're reaching out. They've been reaching out to the Central Asians, especially the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, and even the Turkmen, which is a very difficult country to deal with for a number of reasons. But I think Putin, he's probably watching this right now. He's not happy about it. I highly doubt that he's thrilled that the leaders are going to Washington. They're getting this much attention. He sees that as a threat. He can't do much about it because he's got his own problems, internal problems. He's got the war in Ukraine. And I think he's being very careful. He's trying to walk a fine line with President Trump because he needs to keep this impression for the Russian people and for the international community that he can still talk to Trump, that he can salvage the relationship. And so I don't think he's going to confront President Trump directly, but the Russians are very good behind the scenes at causing all kinds of mischief. What we call like the gray zone or, the active measures front. So they've done it before in Central Asia to competitors, and I'm sure they're going to try now. And we should also mention there's a very large number of Russians that have fled from Russia to Central Asia as a result of the war in Ukraine. And so Russia has some influence through those people, through that community. And as Paul mentioned, there are large numbers of Central Asians, Uzbeks, and from what I know, Uzbeks and Tajiks, guest workers in Russia. And those countries have to be very careful too with not upsetting Russia because Russia has some leverage over them, given the fact that the money that they're making, sending back to Central Asia to support families, the economies, their vulnerability, as we saw with the Azeris recently, the Russians clamped down on Azeris living in Russia, caused a big row. So the Central Asians have to be aware of that and be very careful at it. And then, as Paul mentioned, the Russians also in northern Kazakhstan, they have influence. So the Kazakhs have got to walk a fine line. And then to your point about sanctions, I think this is one of the things that will probably be discussed during meetings in Washington today and tomorrow is, okay, the Central Asians are going to be looking for a way to continue to do business without crossing the U.S. and sanctions policies. But, they're realistically, they're kind of tied to Russia in a way, and they're going to be looking for my guess is some flexibility from this administration on what they can do, how they can do it without running afoul of U.S. sanctions and law.
Paul, who are the other key players in the region that might have some influence that we don't naturally think about?
Talking like non-Central Asian countries, or
Yeah, I don't know, like Does the Gulf play a hand here? I feel like they get involved in different places.
Yeah, yeah. Glenn mentioned Turkey is probably the big one there. Korea, you've got some large Korean populations there, believe it or not. So they're amping up their flights, from Korea and from Asia. So Japan is becoming more active there. So there's some very developed countries that are working there that are really imparting knowledge and technology. There's a lot of educational exchanges though. So and then you got the EU, which is really especially from an energy standpoint with what's going on in Russia and with what they can get from Central Asia. And then again, all the proposed transshipment logistics lines that will crisscross up and down east west through Central Asia. China working through it. So China's a big one there as well. Obviously, working on a lot of infrastructure, a lot of rail lines. Some of these are a little too ambitious, probably aren't going to pan out. Iran. I mean, frankly, I think a sleeper here is Iran, where if things can go south and hit the ports in Iran. That's something I see that happening in the future, because right now, they're trying to rail stuff through Afghanistan down to Pakistan ports, which I think that's going to end up being harder than going through Iran. But that'll depend on sanctions and issues like that. So it's a lot of big countries that are or regions or blocks that are running around Central Asia.
And in your former role, kind of like I would assume a meeting such as this, there'd probably be like, hey, what should we be thinking about maybe from the whole of government approach? What would you be advising maybe administration on with what you know, given this meeting coming up now?
I think, I mean, one of the first things is we've got to accept that, that we've got to respect their multi-vector, that's their phrase, but their multi-vector foreign policy. So I think, we've got to be mature enough and practical enough and pragmatic enough to understand that these countries cannot afford to alienate, some of their trading partners, even if they're adversaries of ours. And that's not unique to Central Asia, obviously. But it's probably even it's a lot tougher and a lot more prominent there. So I think there is, I think that's got to be, and I would argue, or I'm hoping that that's been put in all the the right people's talking points there. But I think I think the big issue here is getting U.S. business out there. And I keep harping on that because it's just, it's great to have, government to government, public sector, add a few more bodies in the embassy. That's great. But it's that business, the Chamber of Commerce type of stuff going on out there and getting these trade delegations out there. So I think, I would put that front and center in the talking points of hosting in America, in the U.S., trade delegations from these countries, which, did come along for the ride with some of these heads of state. But I think, turn that around, just like Trump did in the Middle East and hitting those countries, bringing the heavy hitters in the appropriate industries, right? So it's not everything, but it's the energy, it's the extractables, the mining. Australia is doing stuff there. You've got Canadian firms that are out there, but we do stuff already, so it's not like we're not there at all. But it could be amped up. And again, not to harp on the rare earths and the critical minerals, but that is a big deal. And these are countries that are asking us to show up. That's the frustrating part. It's like, show up. They're asking us, they're inviting us. And oh, by the way, the place is very stable. It's very secure. I mean, it's got a lot going for it. And it's got a lot of opportunity from a business standpoint though. So, and a lot of the infrastructure, as Glenn knows, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's old Soviet era, irrigation and water management and farming, which is highly inefficient. Water is a huge thing out there. They need help in that. So our big US, Bechtels and big construction firms ought to be out there. Archer Daniels Midland ought to be out there, imparting knowledge, equipment, technology, modernizing their key industries out there, like in some of these countries that are very agricultural based. So again, a lot of business opportunity.
How do you prove to business? I'm sure both of you get a lot of inquiries from businesses who might be interested in going there. I have to imagine, because of the neighborhood, that how do you prove to them that there is stability and security in going there? Just rule of law, war going on in different borders.
I'll let you answer that, Paul.
Now, and don't get me wrong. I mean, these countries, they've got some fixing to do in their own governments, though. So they're very inefficient. There's some that have the bureaucracy, the levels of red tape, There is corruption. So I'm not saying it's not utopia. I think from stability from a political standpoint, I can't think of any of these countries right now that's any kind of threat. Again, it's from the neighboring countries, that are staring down at them. From a security standpoint, I don't know, Glenn, you've spent more time out there than I did, but you walk around the streets. I mean, you truly feel safe. It's a kind of culture where they respect authority. They're interested in foreigners, and so I think you always feel very welcome. Again, it's far away. It's esoteric. It's a little there's a mystique about it, but I think you get out there. It's a very warm place. The people are warm. The food is great. The scenery, the history, the culture is fantastic. So I think it's just, I think we psych ourselves out, and it's just, take that first step. And I've talked to, there's one businessman who does a lot of infrastructure stuff overseas, and a lot of it's in Europe, and he's in the Middle East. And I keep telling him, I say, hey, let's take a trip there. Let me just kind of walk you around a little bit. And there's some folks I know that you ought to talk to. And I think they could, he's like an Elon Musk kind of guy, but in a different line of business. And I said, there's a place for you in a place like that. And I'm not a business guy, so I understand shareholder value. It's got to be the business case. It's so easy for me to say, but what I'm saying is there's a lot of undiscovered opportunity there, a lot of unexplored opportunity. I do know that much. And I do know that I've got these countries, when I was out there, these, very senior officials in these countries almost pleading with us, Mr. Paul, where are the Americans? The Chinese are here, the Russians are here, the Europeans are here. You're the partner of choice. Where's the Golden Arches, the McDonald's? I mean, it's almost that simple, but it truly is. It's a status thing. In fact, I just saw where a Burger King is opening, I think in Tashkent. Okay. Of all things. All right. Now you could argue that's not progress, but maybe they'll have their version of plov or something.
Well, the
But
Whopper,
anyway, what's that?
the Whopper.
The Whopper.
I like
Yeah.
myself a good Whopper.
No, I like it too. But it's that kind of thing where I think you show up and you've got people there that are very interested in the U.S. They're looking at the tech stuff. They're very attuned to social media. They know what's going on in the world. And you've got these countries have very young populations, very educated. More and more are traveling and studying in the U.S. though. So you've got a really good audience out there, and you've got a land that's a region that's it's almost like the final frontier. It's a blank slate in a lot of ways, in ways that would be beneficial to U.S. business.
Ryan, maybe we should learn that these countries, they can be complicated. They have a lot of traditions they don't align with our traditions. The way they do business sometimes doesn't align with the way we do business. When we talk about security, I think most U.S. companies are looking for security for their investment, from protection from corruption, from protectionism, from a lot of the things that, you face in other countries. I think that can be done. And I think this administration, probably the message should be, and maybe it will be, look, we will encourage Americans to come, you protect American investors, but we'll bring them to you. And I think this administration, the belief is, like to Paul's point earlier, we can't send the U.S. military to fix every problem, but we can send U.S. investment, we can send U.S. companies. And I've argued for years that if you want to change these countries and bring them closer to, let's say, the Western European democratic values that, are like U.S. values, you got to bring U.S. investment, you got to bring U.S. companies. They have to be side by side with Americans, gaining the experience. I think patient and realistic, and of course firm with the leaders of these countries. We are going to protect the interests of U.S. investors, and we expect you to do that. But you can benefit by making sure your house is in order. It'll pay off for you and your people, because they do need the investment, they do need the experience, they do need the technology. And I think young people in the region are very, very hungry for an opportunity to work with U.S. companies. So, and it's a great time. I think this visit, this summit, the administration's view that they should pay more attention to Central Asia, spot on. I'm all with it. I think it's great. I just hope we can take advantage of it, and U.S. companies can kind of take that leap of faith, maybe have a little courage, because I think they'll benefit from it. And the one thing that does worry me is, there are a lot of countries that need a lot of help right now. So if you look, Ukraine needs help. Gaza right now needs help. Lebanon needs help. At some point, Iran's going to need help. We got to think about that. Venezuela is probably going to need help in the Western Hemisphere. My prediction, because that narco state can't last forever, and of course, parts of our own country need help. So sometimes it's hard to keep people's attention. That's what I see right now with a lot of companies. It's one day. It's one. By the way, there are people talking about going back into Afghanistan now, which is interesting. And we talk about a country that has influence over Central Asia. One of those countries is Afghanistan.
Yeah,
right.
I would to your point on the help there, Glenn. That the help that they need and want is not of the charity type, though. So I think that's a big distinction. Where Central Asia, it's listen, invest here, create jobs here. We've got the talent, we've got the workforce, the human capital, we've got the resources. So but they do need that They need development assistance, but it's of the nature. It's of the business nature where it's actually going to pay. It's literally going to pay dividends and it's creating business and stuff. So I think it's there's US, well, they were out there. USAID was out there, and they were, doing things of that nature. Yeah. So again, it's not to oversimplify it, but it's a win-win proposition. And I think it's the help they need is more from the private sector. So again, it's not it's not U.S. tax dollars going out there to, frankly, I wouldn't even argue for that. It's really, the Chamber of Commerce kind of stuff, and it's bringing business to business. U.S. business, meeting with host country officials, telling them what needs to happen. As to Glenn's point there, it's listen, getting our revenues out, getting our dollars out, et cetera. Work, labor laws, things of that nature need to be modernized and brought up to, U.S. standards, Western standards. That's the kind of help they need. It's it's sort of like an intellectual type of assistance, but it's better they learn from us than from others.
Amen.
When you look at the C5+1 and then think of implications for the war in Ukraine and China, I would assume rare earth opportunities, although they aren't maybe certainly not as staggering as rare earth deposits elsewhere in the world, it is still progress. Like you still have to process things. So that I would assume vis-a-vis China is a good thing from a U.S. perspective. With Ukraine, anything that upsets Putin is probably good in that area, forcing him just a little bit to look to his south instead of towards Ukraine. What else should we think about as Americans that could help either Ukraine or with our relations with China because of this type of meeting?
What do you say, Glenn?
Well, I mean, one, Paul touched upon it before, but like the whole issue of logistics, transportation, and who's going to control that is going to be very, very important in the future. And that's another reason why U.S. companies need to get involved actively. That it's a benefit for the United States. Put Ukraine aside, it's just a big benefit. It's a very important region, and there's a lot of potential in Central Asia that has not been tapped. And it's a strategic region. If you look at it, geopolitically, where it is, what countries the Central Asian states border. Historically, it has always been, the Silk Road ran through Central Asia. It's really important, and we can't afford to ignore it. And we can benefit if we pay more attention to it. And to Paul's point too, yes, this is not, hopefully the administration will do what it's trying to do in Syria, and that is bring in like Saudi money, Emirati money, working with U.S. companies, working with other partners. The formula in some parts of the Middle East now that need more attention is, okay, money from the Gulf, U.S. kind of oversight, protection, maybe overall management, and then Turkish construction companies. Maybe in Central Asia, you have the Koreans, as Paul said. You have other, the Japanese have been active in the region before. There are other players that can play an important role and balance out. This is just the counterweight to China's power, in my opinion, right? And then stability on Russia's southern border and an ability to, let's just say protect the region from Russia as well, and the negative impact that Russia can have when it wants to, which is unfortunately too often.
And again, the timing's fantastic because the resentment these countries have towards Russia, I think, only grows. The paranoia, the skepticism, and sort of their vulnerability. Some countries more than others, as we've touched on. But they also feel the same way about China, and they see the Belt and Road Initiative, and they see they're reading the fine print, and they're seeing sort of that buyer's remorse around the world. So, and I'm not saying hey, U.S. is all high and mighty, but they do know, and I think it's maybe I'm a little biased here, but we're the gold standard, and whether it's environmental protection, whether it's labor rights, things of that nature. So I think, from a technology standpoint, especially, the AI, the cyber digital domain, that whole area, they really want to learn from the best. They want it from us. They don't trust China doing stuff like that. And then on the extractables, Glenn touched on it. They want to be more than just, the mine where the stuff comes from and gets shipped out and refined elsewhere. So that's more technology they need. So it's doing, it's the processing in country, it's the manufacturing in country, and so I think there's a lot more chance there. They, Uzbekistan, as Glenn knows, Chevrolet, General Motors has a huge plant there. You've never seen more Chevrolet. You see more Chevrolet cars in Uzbekistan than you see in Detroit. I kid you not. I kid you not.
Interesting.
It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. I've never seen more. You're in a traffic jam, and 4 out of 5 cars are Chevrolets. I kid you not. But locally made. So, there is U.S. business there, and they want more of it. But it's also, for them, it's protection from those vulnerabilities that they're very well aware of. It's trying to leapfrog. I think back to third world nations where I've served, where you couldn't get a landline phone line. Well, they just jumped right ahead to cellular. So all these countries around the world, the poorest countries in the world, you never got a landline because they went right to cellular. I mean, it was easier you build a tower and build towers around the country. You've got phone, and I kid you not, and they just jump right ahead. So here you have Central Asia saying, okay, we're not really interested in 5G. Give us the next best thing. So they're really, they've got that clean slate kind of mentality there, opportunity where you can come in with the latest technology and then build on it. And it's, they want to kind of learn from the best though. So it's an exciting time.
I'll say I do remember.
They have good food. Good food.
Yeah.
Very good.
And drink.
I transited, I think is it Manas? Is that how you say it? That facility when I was coming out of Afghanistan, like that was a foothold that we had that allowed us to transit and move through the region.
We had 2 bases in the region after 9/11, Manas and Karshi-Khanabad in Uzbekistan. And we allowed those bases to go away. I think many of the locals wanted them to stay. It's a very long and complicated story. But the Russians, the Russians still have military facilities in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And they insisted that we had to leave, but of course they could stay. Personally, I regret that we allowed those bases to leave. I think that it would be a benefit for those countries today. And it would have been very helpful on the Afghan front in 2021, I think.
Paul, if we can just get your take quick, because I know before you were SCAMC, looks like you were Western Hemisphere lead at the agency. And there's just a few things going on there that are different now, it seems like. I can't even remember the acronym we had for that. Like you had SCAMC, you had all these others. I don't remember what it was for Western Hemisphere, but
well, they called it WHMSI. It was WHMC, so they said WHMSI.
WHMSI, okay. What are your thoughts on what you're seeing now? Any surprise, concern? I'm sure you get asked a lot of questions on that now.
I'm not, it's a little dismaying to see what's happened with Colombia. I mean, that's really, you talk about like a rock solid relationship. It was it was a poster child for how to do programs, especially our, agency kind of programs the right way. And to see it kind of go, south as it has. And it's interesting because I was down there, and this current, the current president of, Petro down in Colombia, the Colombians themselves, the folks that we dealt with and others, and sort of the, you could say it's the elite, whatever, but it's, that's a lot of the country. They also had concerns about this guy, former Marxist, rebel member, and they've been dismayed to see what's happened there. And so what we see going on and with the drug boats and things, and him making statements. So the Venezuela thing, I grew up in Venezuela, so I was an oil brat. So, I spent a lot of my life in Latin America, and I was a Latin America guy in the agency. So Venezuela is near and dear to my heart. The crap we see, I hate to say it, it'll offend somebody, but it couldn't happen to better people. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but it's, the thing about Venezuela is it is a 100% self-inflicted wound. What they've done, what Chavez did, what Maduro have done, self-inflicted, completely avoidable. All right. This is a country, the largest proven reserves of oil that up the top, which they sit, no ethnic strife, no terrorism. I mean, so all the, man-made disasters, that have happened around the world that have brought countries down. None of that. This is human nature. It's greed. It's the socialism, and then sort of this, kleptocracy, thugocracy. So it's fascinating watching it. I sort of chuckle at some of the, the news things I see about it, and people speculating and what have you. So yeah. And then Mexico is another interesting one as well. So that's one where, we've got to play a little nice with them. But I also chuckle when I see people, in the bleacher seats kind of commenting on how to tackle the drug war there. And if only we did this or do more of that. I think there's a lot of folks talking who don't really have any sense of reality and haven't dealt with the country. It's a great country, but there's also some very, very deep institutional structural problems that make a lot of really good, helpful suggestions completely irrational and unfeasible. So it's gonna be tough. The Venezuela thing, listen, I'm not. There's a lot of breathless. Oh my God, it's Cuba, the missile crisis all over again. There's things of that nature. I'm not one of those that's getting exercised over it. This talk of covert action and whatever President Trump talked about. I personally have some doubts about that. I think there's some folks are kind of throwing some chum in the water here, but I could be wrong. I'm not in the know on some of this stuff, but I do have fun watching it.
Ryan, about Western Hemisphere, we can tie this back to the show we did with Joey Gagnar, because if you see what just happened in Rio, some of the fighting there, I just read an article where some of the gangs were using FPVs to drop explosives on targets. Right. So now this is in the Western Hemisphere. We said during that podcast, that ISIS was doing that in Syria, even, before February 2022. So just another reminder that people like the critical infrastructure in this country, we need to be really, really aware of what the danger is, what the threat is from these drones and modern warfare, which gangs in Rio are definitely figuring out how to use. We better
The Mexican cartels. If you've ever seen video and pictures of some of their militarized units, it's unbelievable. They would put the Mexican National Army to shame. I mean, it's truly, these guys look like a SEAL team formation. I mean, they're that good with air assets. I mean, I'm talking, it's frightening, and it's right next door. So we better take it seriously.
What last question, just before we let people know how they can find you, Paul, is, and you feel free to sidestep this question. We will just edit this out. But I think from the timing, you were running Whimsy when Havana Syndrome info broke publicly. Just from having led much smaller teams in the military, like how you feel about your people. Just curious, I selfish curiosity here of like how, as a leader, did you deal with that as that was unraveling?
Yeah, that would happen when I was in charge of it. And it was part of it's a cultural thing where people there in country were feeling things, sensing things, but those who have served in Havana for decades were used to being harassed and having stuff done to them. This was obviously something new, but I think folks initially uh, sort of chalked it up to, well, it's just it's just harassment. It's something going on, and they didn't it wasn't reported in a early on.
Mhm.
And I think and I'm not a medical person, but I think folks said, had there been earlier kind of notification from a medical standpoint, there could have been earlier intervention for some who ended up being more affected and injured. Um, it was a tough one though, and it was, but it's yeah. There's really there was, and to this day, I'm not at least when I left, I mean, still no good explanation. You got a lot of people who are dead set, serious. It had to be this, and there's a lot of criticism of government didn't do this, or the agency, the health folks, the medical unit. I would caution folks to not be real hasty here, but I've had know people who came back from there seriously impacted and regretted going there. And thankfully we pulled out all the stops to get all the treatment and everything else, and I think probably continues to this day. So it's a real big enigma. We kept saying nothing happens in that country without the Cubans knowing about it. So whether it was, the North Koreans doing something, the Russians doing something, the Cubans have the place wired, especially when it deals with, U.S. embassy,
I'm sure.
persons' homes, where they pretty much have their way with it, anytime they want. So Yeah, it's a real head scratcher, and very disturbing. From some of the people that I know.
Ugh, right. Um, Paul, how can people find you? I'm sure folks are interested in getting insights that you.
Sheesh. I'm on LinkedIn, so that's the extent of my social media. So Paul Farley on yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, and it says who I was, assistant director, former intel officer, assistant director of CIA for South and Central Asia. So happy to talk to folks, and yeah, I get pretty energized and jazzed up over some of these regions. I again feel a little evangelical, especially over Central Asia. I'm very bullish on it. Is a good way to put it. Again, not going to be easy, and it's not going to be without hiccups. But I think there's just some good opportunity. You see where Uzbekistan is waiving visas for U.S. travelers effective next year. So go down to Samarkand or Bukhara, and there's Glenn was talking about the Silk Road. I mean, there's some unbelievable culture, just great things to see and do there. So I think it's going to be one of those go-to tourist places, and on top of the business stuff.
Thanks to Paul for taking the time, and thanks Ryan again for hosting this one with me. And great topic, great timing. I think if anyone wants to reach out to Paul, they probably do it through like our site, right? Through restricted handling.
You can come to info@restrictedhandling.com. We'll get you in touch. You've got West Exec Advisors, Paul. I also
Yeah.
saw there, so people can connect with you.
Yeah, and they should reach out to Paul, but only if they have serious questions. No questions about his time at Chippendales. Oh, I was supposed to mention.
The
Awesome.
lost years. Yes.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate the time.
I enjoyed it. Good talking to you.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it for free at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.